Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thank you for coming to this book talk. Before I get started, I just want to warn you that there may be some slides in here that are a little upsetting, maybe not wholly appropriate for church, but it's part of the story, and I thought it was important to tell it. So I'm talking today about my new book, which was published by Indiana University Press a month ago. It's called The City on the Edge, Pandemic, Protest, and Polarization. Let me just read to you a little bit from my first chapter, and it's called Microcosm. Some years are more memorable than others. In 1775, American farmers fired a shot heard around the world and turned the world upside down. In 1918, the Great War ended and a global influenza pandemic began. In 1968, assassinations, anti-war protests, and a close presidential election rattled America. In 2001, the World Trade Center in New York collapsed after being hit by jet planes hijacked by terrorists. The events of those years still reverberate today, and then came 2020. The year began with the news that another deadly disease, COVID-19, was spreading around the world. Several months later, a Minneapolis police officer killed a black man named George Floyd. That murder touched off what some call the largest protest movement in American history. At the same time, mass shootings increased by 47%, and America saw huge increases in gun-related incidents. Likely factors were the COVID-19 pandemic and resulting economic downturn, a rise in drug use, an increase in gun ownership, and inequities in healthcare, education, housing, and employment. The pandemic was a trigger, but in the background was a presidential election campaign called the most turbulent White House race in modern history. Intermingled with the Floyd protests and campaign events were right-wing counter-protests and rallies challenging public health measures and the election result itself. Now, you all know where Wauwatosa is, but it's important to remember where we are in relation to everything else. Chicago's down here, and Milwaukee's right next door, of course. So we're 75 miles from Madison, and we're 5 or 6 hours from Minneapolis, depending on how fast you drive. Though turmoil in big cities dominated the news, protests and unrest spread to smaller cities too. As the new mayor of Wauwatosa, a mid-sized, mostly white city bordered on three sides by the majority-minority city of Milwaukee, I grappled with the impact of the pandemic, an economic crisis, a mass shooting, and year-long racial protests. And my hometown played a quiet but crucial role in the outcome of the presidential election. By the way, that was all in my first 7 months as mayor. Throughout 2020, the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN, NBC News, the British Broadcasting Company, Japan Broadcasting Corporation, and other news media covered events in Wauwatosa. We were a microcosm of a troubled and changing America. In 2020, a perfect storm of stresses fueled anger, fear, frustration, and protests across the country and around the world. But a deeper force was at work: America's perpetual refusal to tell the truth about itself. The stresses ripped our cities apart and challenged the country's mayors unrelentingly throughout the year and beyond. That's essentially my first chapter. I just read that because, again, Wauwatosa was a microcosm of everything that happened in America that year. That's how I sold my book. I sold my book in 20 minutes. It's not supposed to be that easy. But I told the editor, proposal, that everything that happened right here in Wauwatosa. And he said, write the book, but I want to know more than Wauwatosa. I want you to write about Seattle and Portland and Minneapolis. It's all in there. It's all about all the mayors in America and what we dealt with. But, of course, Wauwatosa figures prominently throughout. And you'll see more as we go through that. Throughout 2020, we were the site of almost daily protests, 98 days and nights. because one of our police officers, Joseph Mensa, had killed 3 men of color in the previous 5 years. The last one occurred 2.5 months before I became mayor. Each time the Milwaukee County District Attorney found that Mensa had acted in self-defense and declined to prosecute him. Long before this, Wauwatosa had been a racial tinderbox. Despite its abolitionist beginnings, it had excluded black people for much of its existence. With a nighttime population of about 50,000 people, we're Wisconsin's 14th largest city, but during the day, we're the 4th largest city in Wisconsin after Milwaukee, Madison, and Green Bay. We have over 105,000 people here every workday. We have the state's largest medical center, the state's busiest shopping mall. We have colleges and universities. We have factories. We are the crossroads of metropolitan Milwaukee. As I said in a podcast from a woman in Green Bay, we are a mini metropolis. Because she said, Wauwatosa? And I said, we're a mini metropolis. We're the crossroads of metropolitan Milwaukee. People of different races interact at Mayfair and at the medical center in ways they don't do anywhere else in Metro Milwaukee. Think about it. Where else do we get together? We get together at Mayfair and at the medical center. You go to the baseball stadium or the Bucks games, you don't see a lot of racial intermixing, even though there are players of all races on those teams. That makes us ground zero for racial friction. I became mayor in April 2020. I had prepared for public service with degrees in journalism, public administration, and law, and had spent decades in all levels of government. For 24 years, I had litigated cases on behalf of people who suffered job discrimination. One was a race discrimination case that set national precedents. Another involved undocumented female workers who were sexually assaulted at agricultural facilities in Iowa. For that case, I appeared on PBS Frontline in a show called Rape in the Fields in 2013. I also applied to have Wauwatosa designate the home of its first black family as a landmark, and it urged the creation of an Equity and Inclusion Commission. During 2020, however, my background and my lack of legal authority to give protesters what they wanted, which was to fire Officer Mensa, didn't matter. What mattered was that I was the white face of the system at which they directed their anger and demands. But again, this is not just about Wauwatosa. It's about how the events of 2020 changed America and still reverberate in our economy, politics, and psyche. But the question is, why was 2020 such a tumultuous year? Columbia University professor John McWhorter, who is black, explained, tragically, hideously, Americans learn of black people dying under appalling circumstances involving police officers quite often. But he said something besides George Floyd's murder had caused the protests nationwide. The fact that we have been in pandemic isolation for 2 months, and that around that time it was becoming clear that conditions were not going to change anytime soon. In a report 2 years ago, the American Psychological Association stated, our society is experiencing the psychological impacts of a collective trauma. The pandemic created a collective experience among Americans. While the lockdowns may seem like the distant past, the aftermath remains. The report also noted the impact of global conflicts, racism and racial injustice, inflation, and climate-related disasters on our psyches. My thesis, the thesis of John McWhorter, the thesis of the American Psychological Association, is that the pandemic and everything else that happened, but the pandemic drove 2020 into the history books in a way that we're going to look back on as a watershed year in American history and maybe world history. So, this is the front of my house, July 14th, 2020. I had 40 nights of protest just at my house alone. And again, I couldn't give people what they wanted, because on the sidewalk, it said, people would write, fire Mensa, fire Weber, Barry Weber was our police chief. I have no authority as mayor under state law to hire, fire, or discipline a police officer or chief. None whatsoever. And yet people showed up 40 nights at my house demanding what I could not give them. The isolation and economic stress made everyone anxious. First, the protests were against pandemic lockdowns. Then, after George Floyd was murdered, the protests against racism erupted. And of course we had counter-protests, and you'll see that later as we go through this. Though many protests were peaceful, many were not. Arson, vandalism, and looting caused $1 to $2 billion in damage in just 2 weeks after George Floyd died, making it the worst civil disaster in American history. Studies found that most of the violence was committed by, quote, local hooligans, sometimes gangs, sometimes just individuals that are trying to take advantage of an opportunity. Some of the protests were peaceful, many were not. I heard this over and over again. Why are you doing this? Everybody's peaceful. And I'd say, well, I don't see that in front of my house. I don't see that in the police reports. I don't see it in the Facebook streams that I'm watching live at my home. I didn't see it during the year. This was Hart Park in 2020, folks. This was the listening session that the Common Council wanted. It was a good thing I didn't know there were guns there because I was 15 feet from people who were screaming things at me. I was the moderator of a session that was anything but moderate. And afterwards, the staff told me, you know, people are carrying assault rifles. And I said, well, thank God I didn't know. That's 2020. And then at my home, people would put signs like this. I allegedly was an accomplice, despite my history, my background, the fact that I wasn't mayor when the shootings and killings happened. I was an accomplice. You would think that the right wing, the left wing didn't like me much, the extremes. People on the right wing maybe would like me, but there was a 100% vote of no confidence against me because I allegedly was helping the protesters against the police. So if anything comes out of my book, when you read it, you'll see that I don't like extremists on either wing of the spectrum. And they didn't like me much either. The police, one detective even put this slide in a PowerPoint that he created for internal purposes, which was later pulled. But see, no probable cause for involvement in the Mensa shooting yet. There was a shooting at Officer Mensa's house. So the police were accusing me of somehow motivating the protest. What I was trying to do was keep Wauwatosa from sliding into chaos. A little bit more of that chaos, right around the same time, the White Wauwatosa letter. We whites must stand together. We must keep Wauwatosa free from blacks and their lack of morals. We must keep blacks from destroying our property, raping our wives and daughters, and recruiting our children into street gangs. Wow. Now, we never knew who produced that. We don't know whether it was a small thing or a big thing. But a couple days later, and of course I denounced this, but a couple days later I got an email from the British Broadcasting Company. Said, I'm a producer of the Up All Night show on BBC Channel 5, and we'd like to interview you about what's going on in Wauwatosa. I said, this has got to be a joke. The BBC does not want to interview the mayor of Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. Well, sure enough, I wrote back, and the BBC wanted to interview the mayor of Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. That night I was on the BBC. I have a friend in Northern Ireland who was working the overnight shift at the port of Warren Point. And he said I practically fell out of my chair when I heard your voice. He said, what's your playbook? And I said, I hadn't thought about it that way, but let me give you 2 quotes. I said, Robert Louis Stevenson said, keep your fears to yourself and share your courage with others. And then I said, my friend Abraham Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, said we must move forward with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. I said, that's my playbook. But this continued. I believe this is the same guy who came down Wauwatosa Avenue with a gun a year later and pointed it in the window of a black woman's car with her 3 children, small children, in the back, and kept her from proceeding. And when a police officer tried to intervene, protesters surrounded him and kept him from protecting the woman. So when we talk about peaceful protests in Wauwatosa, folks, I didn't see a lot of it. I really didn't. The man on the right was shot by Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha a week earlier. That's Gage Grosskreutz. He showed up at our Wauwatosa protest. He got arrested when I declared a curfew in October 2020. I'm getting ahead of the story. Khalil Coleman was one of the leaders, daily leaders of our protests. In 2021, he began serving a 10-year sentence in Kentucky for robbing a drug house at gunpoint down there. Again, there were many, many sincere people who protested against the murder of George Floyd and protested against what was going on in Wauwatosa. But the point here is that protests are often hijacked by people with a different agenda. And Khalil Coleman was one of those people. I also had a Wauwatosa resident named Brian Anderson who had already served 3 prison sentences for burglary, and in October 2020 was sentenced to another, he was convicted again of burglary, but in the meantime he was sending us letters lecturing us on morality, and I thought, a 4-time convicted felon probably doesn't know a lot about morality, but we'll see. So in 2020, this group was called the People's Revolution. As I said, 98 days and nights of protests in Wauwatosa, including 40 at my home. Protesters blocked busy intersections for hours, drove cars on both sides of the streets while honking their horns, screamed profanities, wrote obscenities on sidewalks, placed vulgar signs on lawns, played extremely loud music, shined strobe lights into house windows in the eyes of police, threw trash on lawns, carried guns, drove cars on lawns and sidewalks, and engaged in shoving matches with police, sometimes as late as 2 a.m. in front of my house. All of those things. And elsewhere in Wauwatosa. As I said, on August 8th, 2020, the protests turned even uglier. Scores of protesters surrounded the home of Officer Mensah and his family. His wife ran outside as outsiders tried to flatten her car tires. When she was surrounded, Mensah came out and a protester hit him in the head with a bullhorn, and another protester fired a shotgun at him, hit his rear door, missing him by inches. 3 protesters were later convicted for that incident. 1 received a 3-year prison sentence, and 2 were convicted of misdemeanors. Only a few weeks later, Jacob Blake was shot by a police officer in Kenosha. Now let me read from that part of the chapter. In Kenosha, rioters destroyed garbage trucks, streetlights, and traffic signals valued at $2 million. Damage to private property totaled $52 million. 40 buildings were destroyed, and 100 other buildings were damaged. 80 businesses were affected by the riots and lost $25 to $30 million. 2 protesters were shot and killed by an Illinois teenager named Kyle Rittenhouse. 250 people were arrested. Many were from other states. 2 militia members from Missouri were arrested on federal gun charges. One told a witness that he was going to Kenosha with the intention of possibly using firearms on people. 4 Minnesota men were charged with arson. 3 were charged with setting fires in a bar, looting a pharmacy and a gas station, and conspiring to steal controlled substances and transport stolen goods. 1 man was charged with illegally possessing ammunition as a convicted felon. During the riots, a woman saw her Kenosha store on fire while finding a 70-year-old employee on the sidewalk with a broken jaw. Quote, with a gun in one hand and the steering wheel in another, reported the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. She sped him to the hospital in her car. She said, my fear is the message of the peaceful protesters who legitimately want and deserve change are not going to be heard because of the violence. Businesses can rebuild and buildings can be replaced, but that message is lost. I should note that during the curfew period in October 20 in Wauwatosa, the mayor of Kenosha called me up and expressed his support. And he said, "Are you seeing any outsiders?" And I said, "Yes. I'm watching them on Facebook, live streams from Seattle and Texas and other parts of the country." And he said it was outsiders that caused all the trouble in Kenosha. And in fact, that's proven by the arrest records. The right to protest peacefully, not violently, is guaranteed by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But the Supreme Court has long held that First Amendment rights are not absolute. They are subject to what are called time, place, and manner restrictions, such as limits on noise levels, protest hours, the number of protesters, and if and how protesters can picket a person's home. Such limits, however, must not favor one viewpoint over another, must be narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest, and must provide alternative ways to communicate the protesters' message. In May 2020, the mayor of Washington, D.C., who was black, imposed a curfew for several nights. She recognized the outrage over racism and the Floyd murder, but noted that many businesses and government buildings were vandalized, burned, or looted, and that there had been what she called a glorification of violence, particularly during later hours of the night. Protesters sued, saying the curfew violated their rights to free speech and assembly. The federal appeals court disagreed. It held that the curfew was appropriate and allowed such alternatives as protesting during the day or at night after the curfew expired. The court wrote, "Even though the curfew limited some valuable opportunities for public speech and association, the public interest in keeping the peace by responding effectively to a surge in vandalism, arson, and looting was not directed at the suppression of expression, and it justified the order's temporary restriction on nighttime activity in public spaces." On October 7th, 2020, the Milwaukee County District Attorney announced he would not charge Officer Mensa. Based on that and the notion that we had seen previous violence and destruction in Milwaukee, Madison, and sometimes in Wauwatosa, but especially in Kenosha only 5.5 weeks earlier, the DA's decision raised an imminent threat of unrest here. And for that reason, I issued a curfew order prohibiting people from being outside in Wauwatosa between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m. for 5 nights, from October 7th through October 12th, 2020. Protests were allowed during the day. Now this is the day before, and you can see businesses being boarded up. If there's ever a juxtaposition, this is it. Businesses boarding up for fear of the violence that might happen, and people writing protest messages on the sidewalk next to them. This is North Avenue at 65th Street. The day that the DA announced his decision, I was denounced as a co-conspirator and told to resign by protesters outside the Milwaukee County Courthouse. I was asked, by the way, 3 weeks later by the Milwaukee Press Club in a newsmaker conference. He said, "Well, people are demanding you resign. What's your response?" I said, "The last time I checked, we live in a democracy." I was elected by 60.5% of the vote earlier this year, and it was a 4-year term. I intend to serve my 4 years, and then we'll let the voters decide again. I was elected by almost 60% the next time. I wasn't going to resign. I point out in the book I'm a marathon runner, and marathon runners don't quit. This, sadly, is the cover of my book. What you don't see in the book is this part. You'd have to do it this way, I suppose, to see it. But that's in front of City Hall on October 7th, 2020. This is the standoff with the protesters on one side and the police and National Guard on the other side. We had police officers from 72 different agencies from around Wisconsin, as well as the Wisconsin National Guard here. You can get the book at Barnes & Noble, and fortunately there won't be a National Guard truck outside when you do that. That's Mayfair that night. Governor Evers pre-positioned the National Guard in sites like Mayfair, the Village, City Hall, and other things. People think I called out the National Guard. I don't have the authority to call out the National Guard. After Kenosha, I thought I should call. I had spoken to Governor Evers' staff in August of 2020 before Jacob Blake got killed. We explored options, and I said, I hope it doesn't come to this, but what happens if we need the National Guard? And they said, well, you're not going to get the National Guard. Nothing enough has happened in Wauwatosa. Of course, that was after Joseph Mentz's house was shot up. And I said, well, if they come, wherever they come from, and the ironic answer was Kenosha, the Kenosha Armory. And I said, how long would it take? And they said 12 to 14 hours. Well, after Jacob Blake was shot and the riots happened in Kenosha, I put it on my calendar to call Governor Evers one Monday morning, and I got a call before I could call. It was his chief of staff saying, you will get the National Guard in Wauwatosa. The point was Governor Evers was not going to let Wauwatosa turn into Kenosha, only a few weeks after Kenosha. After the first night, there was broken glass up and down North Avenue. This is at the corner of Swan Boulevard and North Avenue. Protesters had broken away from City Hall and marched toward Mayfair. And I was watching at our emergency operations center at 99th and Bluma, and we had big screens up, and I was watching Facebook streams, and I saw the group going through here, and a guy pulled a pipe out of his bag. I saw this in real time, and just started smashing windows as he went along in the businesses. So I saw this as it happened. And apartment buildings too, not just the businesses there. But volunteers came out the next morning to clean up, which was obviously a wonderful thing. The third night of the curfew, tear gas was used. Protesters, every night the protesters were told at 7 p.m. that they had to leave. Every night for at least 45 to 50 minutes, there were refusals to leave, face-offs. This night, protesters started leaving, but many stayed and started throwing rocks and bottles and bricks at the police officers and were told to leave, and finally tear gas was used. The police chief was sitting next to me at the emergency operations center, and I said, what's the alternative here? I said, protesters need to leave, but tear gas? And I said, does this mean if we didn't use tear gas, we'd have to use truncheons, billy clubs? And he said, yes, that'd be the only alternative. So as you can read in the book, the most liberal judge in the federal court in Milwaukee said this was appropriate because the protesters were assaulting the police officers. It was not one of the greatest moments in Wauwatosa history. After this, protesters sued the city and me. We had something like, eventually about 70 plaintiffs suing in a couple of cases. In each case, courts upheld my curfew order. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago, one step below the Supreme Court, with judges appointed by Democrats and Republicans, held that we had, quote, enacted the curfew to ensure public safety not because of disagreement with any specific message of protesters or counter-protesters. It'll also emphasize that, quote, a city need not wait to act until violence or harm materializes. Indeed, the government has an interest in preventing emergencies and threats to public safety, not merely responding to them after they transpire. That's an important quote because a lot of people who disagreed with me said, well, you should have waited to see what happened. You shouldn't have brought the National Guard and you shouldn't have the police there. And I said, where were you when Kenosha erupted 5.5 weeks earlier? People died. Black Lives Matter protesters died in Kenosha. 8 blocks of Kenosha burned down. Was I going to let Wauwatosa burn down? Was I going to let Black Lives protesters get killed? I was asked this. I went to a union meeting. They were going to decide whether to give me an endorsement, the Milwaukee Trades Council, for the last election in 2024. And I was asked a whole series of questions, and then the last question was, if you had it to do over again, would you do it differently? And I said, no. And I said, because if I had done nothing, and Wauwatosa had burned down, and 2 people had died, that would have been on me. And people would have rightly criticized me for not protecting the city. No, I wouldn't change a thing. Meanwhile, we had an election going on. This bald guy right here, that's Joe Biden. He was at 71st Street in Wauwatosa. Why was he in Wauwatosa? Well, here's what I wrote. If Donald Trump wins, what's happening this week in Kenosha will be one reason, an Atlantic magazine pundit wrote in August 2020. Maybe the reason. Democratic leaders are reluctant to tarnish a just cause or draw the wrath of their own progressive base. So Democrats continue to mute their response to the violence and hope it will subside, even though it has persisted straight through the summer. In polls, Wisconsin's voters' support for Black Lives Matter protests fell from 61% in June to 48%, only 6 weeks later. On September 1st, Trump visited Kenosha. He denounced the riots as domestic terror and scolded Democratic officials for not accepting his offer of federal enforcement assistance. I was offered that federal enforcement assistance, and I said, you're only going to make things worse. We don't want it. Biden visited Kenosha on September 2nd. The next day, on a Wauwatosa patio, he spoke with 3 mothers about the challenges of sending children back to school during a pandemic. His Wauwatosa visit was intended to blunt Trump's law and order appeal to suburban female voters. 5 weeks later, because of what happened in Kenosha, Governor Evers sent the National Guard to Wauwatosa. That activation and the curfew I declared were unpopular with some people. But what we did not hear was that a Democratic governor or mayor had allowed another city to burn down. On November 3rd, Biden carried Wisconsin, but by only 20,682 votes out of 3 million. In Wauwatosa, which had a 91% voter turnout, Biden received 20,880 votes. Trump received 10,104. Thus, over half of Biden's winning margin in Wisconsin, the state that put him over the top nationally, came from Wauwatosa. Not surprisingly, one commentator has called Wauwatosa, quote, one of the most important cities on the political map in Wisconsin. Though it can't be proved, the actions we took in Wauwatosa in October 2020 seem to have enabled Biden to win Wisconsin in the overall election a month later. Political commentator Charlie Sykes observed, in June, Biden led the Marquette poll by 6 points, but he ended up winning Wisconsin by just 20,600 votes, well under 1 percentage point. He then says, election analyst Jesse Richardson, who blogs on the Political Kiwi website, wrote that he found strong evidence that the rioting in Kenosha resulted in increased support for Donald Trump, and that if we'd seen a similar level of rioting in, say, Milwaukee, it might have cost Joe Biden the state. And then I go on to say, thus had Wauwatosa in Milwaukee County experienced Kenosha-like unrest, Biden might have lost Wisconsin. Though I declared a curfew to protect people and not to help Joe Biden, our actions prevented his defeat. A few Democratic Party officials admitted this to me later. We were an important site, folks. But then the election happened and people were pushing back. And now we had a mass shooting at Mayfair in November of 2020. November 18th, I remember these dates, they're burned into my brain. November 18th, the Wauwatosa Police and Fire Commission blessed the separation agreement that we struck with Joseph Mensa. He agreed to leave in exchange for a payment. So the Police and Fire Commission blessed it, and I went home that night and I said, I can finally have a quiet weekend. The next day we had 8 people shot at Mayfair. I got calls from NBC News, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Japan Broadcasting Corporation. I thought, well, this is not what I had in mind. The events of 2020 affected the 2024 election too. In 2024, it seemed clear that the same battleground states would decide the election, and perhaps over the same issues. When the Democratic candidate Vice President Kamala Harris chose Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate, a Trump surrogate, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis accused Walz of letting Minnesota burn during the unrest of 2020, and Republican Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance appeared in Kenosha to blame Democrats for the 2020 riots there. In November 2024, Trump broke through the Democrats' blue wall of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin again and was elected to a second term. For the 5th time in 7 presidential elections, Wisconsin was decided by less than 1 percentage point. When the race was called for Trump, Wisconsin was the state that put him over the top in electoral college votes, just as it had put Joe Biden over the top 4 years earlier. It appeared that Wisconsin would remain a political battleground for years to come. And now I'm going to give you, a friend of mine read the book and he said, this is my favorite quote in your book. The European Union recognized Wisconsin's importance. As its members pondered what a second Trump presidency would mean for Europe, they knew that they would have to steer a course less dependent on the United States. Quote, "We cannot leave the security of Europe in the hands of voters in Wisconsin every 4 years," said France's Minister Delegate for European Affairs after the election. "Let's get out of collective denial. Europeans must take their destiny in their own hands regardless of who is elected president." So if you don't think you're important, folks, people in Europe know all about you. Well, I should finish by saying that the New York Times, the Atlantic called 2024 the second COVID or second pandemic election, and I agree with that. The New York Times said whether people talked about it or not, the pandemic had already set in motion some of the forces that would make Joe Biden's term in office rocky. It spurred global supply chain shocks that sent inflation soaring. In the years that followed, the public's faith in institutions eroded, and Trump and his allies sought to weaponize that distrust. Communities had fierce battles over school closures and curriculums. People worried about political violence and their economic future. There was also a political backlash against the racial justice protests that had unfolded during 2020. The main thesis of my book is that, again, all of those shocks and things that were put into place in 2020 are still with us and they're still affecting us. Some of this is reflected in the BB hole that still exists in my front window on my porch. Because of the pandemic, the Atlantic magazine observed bad behavior of all kinds. Everything from rudeness and carelessness to physical violence has increased. This is from my 6th chapter. On the political right, protesters objected to mask-wearing, vaccine requirements, and equity and inclusion efforts. On the political left, protesters reacted to ongoing abuses of African Americans. Both sides clashed over police reform and other hot-button issues. Because emotions were running so high during 2020, I warned my 3 adult children that someone might take a shot at me. This was not paranoia. Government officials have been shot before and have been shot since by people unhinged by grievance. In fact, someone shot a BB through one of my front windows. In 2020 and for several years thereafter, I went about my usual activities, but always on guard. I was not alone. Princeton University surveys in 2023 and 2024 reported that Local elected officials experience pervasive worries about about their well-being and safety. In 2021, a Rutgers University study found that 96% of mayors in cities with populations over 30,000 reported having suffered psychological violence, an increase of 23% over the previous 6 years, and that 14% had suffered physical violence to themselves or their property. During the pandemic, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey received death threats from right-wing extremists about pandemic restrictions. 3 years after George Floyd was murdered, he was still receiving death threats from left-wing extremists. Even during the best of times, serving as an elected official can take an emotional toll. The toll is also great on our families, who must endure protests and name-calling and provide support to their loved ones while dealing with their own needs. My wife will not read this book. She just won't. Too triggering, she said. I go on to write, the challenges of 2020 were unlike anything I've ever seen, former Columbus Mayor Michael Coleman said in 2021. The mayor's job is already the most difficult job in government, except for maybe the President of the United States, and life as a mayor is more challenging now than it has ever been. The New York Times agreed. 2020 unquestionably took a toll on mayors nationwide, it reported. It was one of the most tumultuous years for American cities since the 1960s, with the social and economic disruptions of the coronavirus pandemic as well as racial justice protests that sometimes turned destructive. Mayors surveyed by Boston University expressed anxiety about the effects of lost tax revenue on their budgets while they dealt with the pandemic and resulting economic downturn. They fretted about the toll the events of 2020 and 2021 took on the mental health of their constituents. As USA Today reported, mayors also face some of the same struggles as their constituents, a spouse sick with COVID or children learning from home as they tackle what is one of their most important jobs, helping their community cope mentally with the incredible uncertainty and projecting confidence they'll get through it. Commenting on such stresses, British psychologists noted that, quote, politics requires resilience and an ability to thrive under pressure. In that respect, it's a lot like elite sports, albeit with a fraction of the reward and adulation. Inevitably, such a profession brings with it mental health risks. So I told you what I told the BBC earlier, and another journalist asked me how I'd advise other mayors dealing with such issues, and I said, we must stay true to the law and our oaths of office and play the long game. The tortoise wins the race, not the hare. I was asked by, again, a podcaster recently, and I said, the North Star, she said, how did you get through? And I said, I had two North Stars. One was my conscience, and the other was the law. I said, other mayors got into trouble when they didn't follow the law. I followed the law, and it got me through. So, thanks to vaccines, the pandemic ended in 2023, but its impact has lingered. Mental health has suffered, dress codes have changed, reckless driving has increased, young workers have resisted returning to the office. Real estate markets have had upheavals. Skepticism of science remains a political issue. Our racial problems continue to divide us. Widespread protests returned in 2024, especially on college campuses, this time over Israel's treatment of Palestinians. And political polarization continues to deepen. But I do believe there's hope. I close my book with these words. Post-2020, it is easy to be pessimistic about our political system. Yet in the past, we have survived a civil war, assassinations, depressions, and political scandals. Impatient for progress, we forget that change takes time and hard work. Wauwatosa's evolution offers hope. Once a rigidly segregated community that excluded people of color, we have slowly returned to our abolitionist roots. Bucking national trends, we've embraced a considerable amount of positive change in the short time since George Floyd's death, but we still have miles to go. To move forward, we must work together. In 1892, a Massachusetts editor wrote a pledge that Americans now recite almost every day. His vow of loyalty to our country's flag was really to the republic for which it stands, an indivisible nation of diverse states and people. Francis Bellamy's Pledge of Allegiance, reflecting the sentiments of the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address, concludes with our national commitment to liberty and justice for all. That has always been worth striving for. As Benjamin Franklin left Independence Hall after the Constitutional Convention completed its work in 1787, a prominent Philadelphian asked him what sort of government we had. "A republic," he replied, "if you can keep it." As ever, our society is a work in progress. For all citizens, it requires not just a pledge, but fidelity to our indivisible republic, a belief in representative government and the rule of law, and dedication to liberty and justice for all. It also requires a willingness to perform our civic duties. Elected officials cannot do that work alone. I'll take some questions if you have them.
I'll preface this by saying that we both served as aldermen on the city council you for 11 years, me for 10, and we overlapped by 6. That's how I knew Dennis, and that's why when you ran for mayor in 2020, I spoke before a group in support, because Dennis is no nonsense, he's focused, he knows exactly what he's doing. There are 2 things I'd like
You've
to...
always been too kind of me.
Well, number 1 is the media. Now, you probably recall Act 10 back, and I still consider Belling a moron because he told people he was completely wrong and we got nothing but phone calls because we were voting on the budget. You mentioned Joseph Menza. When the family's attorney for that young boy that he shot, and the boy had a gun, and you don't know if he's going to shoot you as a police officer, and he had to take action. That boy's attorney went to a judge, and a lot of people didn't know, but the judge's wife worked with the attorney.
Well, ex-wife. They hadn't talked to each other in many years.
And that is a conflict of interest to me, and I petitioned the governor to have that judge removed from the bench. But the other question I had is, there was a lady that was screaming about levy limits, and you asked for an apology. Can you explain what she was talking about and give the actual true facts?
I'm not sure I recall that incident. What?
Oh, okay. I think it was because of the fire departments. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But she did. It's a neighborhood blog.
Oh.
116th. So we all get these websites.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate. Social media is a blessing and a curse, as we all know, right? There's a lot of misinformation and a lot of people hiding behind anonymity, and so people take shots. And I just tell my wife to ignore all those things because.
But I know
during 2020 and beyond, you hear from people on these ends. All the people in the middle are the ones that people say, well, you have a thankless job. And I say, I do not have a thankless job. I get thanked every day by people. I really do.
And I'm one of them. Yeah. But I certainly didn't envy you with all of this things that went on. I thought, this poor man, he gets to be mayor and all of this stuff has to happen. I really felt bad. I
Thank you.
Was hoping that would come to an end sooner than it did.
I'm the lowest paid employee in the city.
I just want to say thank you for your presentation. We do have to leave, but it was very informative.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you're interested in the book, shameless self-promotion. You can buy it. You can buy it at Barnes & Noble at Mayfair. You can buy it on the Indiana University site or Amazon Barnes & Noble, please. Karen.
Back to the white letter.
Yeah.
You said that you never found out who sent it. Who signed it?
We still don't know.
Wasn't it, I thought there was a signature on the
I
bottom,
just
no?
said, yeah, concerned Wauwatosans or something.
Oh, okay,
We have no idea. We don't know if it was actual Wauwatosa people. We don't know if it was
oh,
white people. We don't know if they're from
outside.
Rhinelander.
how was it distributed?
It was just distributed at some doors, and it wasn't even all that widespread. But it certainly got attention, and it should have. And again, that got me my interview on the BBC, which was remarkable. Anybody else? Sir?
Yeah, it seems like the kind of crux or the purpose of this book is to think about prevention rather than reaction, where I think all these protests are kind of coming as a kind of a powder keg situation where there's a lot of anxiety about different things and the collective trauma that you mentioned. What do you think would be a good step to preventing kind of boiling over like this and getting that tipping point, and kind of an extension of that, what can individual citizens do as opposed to kind of threatening mayors?
First of all, people ask me why I wrote the book, and I said, I thought it was important to preserve the history of the moment. They said, well, is it a memoir? And I said, part of it's memoir, but it's not a memoir. That's not the point. Indiana University didn't want to publish my memoir. And the third thing was an explanation. Because again, social media and all the people in the streets, they get, on both sides, they get caught up in emotion and they don't understand. So I've been a lawyer for over 40 years now, and I worked for a federal judge and all that. And I was a journalism major. I understand time, place, and manner. And I understood what section 62.13 of the Wisconsin statutes told me that I couldn't do about hiring, firing, and disciplining of police officers. So people need to understand that mayors can't just go this way or that way. Someone that I knew well, when I told her that during 2020, that I don't have that authority, said, "You're thinking too much like a lawyer." And I said, "Guilty as charged." I'm going to follow the law. Milwaukee didn't follow the law. The Milwaukee Police and Fire Commission, at the same time, literally the same time, demoted the police chief to captain. They got sued and they ended up paying $700,000 to him. We had 2 police chiefs in Milwaukee at the same time because the court reinstated the guy. That's what we would have had if I had just said, to heck with section 62.13, I'm going to just fire this guy. We would have been sued and we would have had even more turmoil. While the protests were going on, I was negotiating Mensah's departure. I couldn't do that in public. People need to understand those things, and that's what the book was all about, not just about me, but what other mayors were going through at the same time. But to answer your final question, at the end I said, we all play a part in this thing. It's not enough to say, elected officials go and do whatever. Politics, government, democracy, it's a team sport. Everybody is on the team. And what I don't want to hear from people is complaints when I say, have you voted? No, my vote doesn't count. Well, it does count. Well, I'm not, whatever. I just don't want to be a part of it. Well, then don't complain about it. Be part of it. Whether you agree with me or not, or anybody else, you got to be part of it. And what is going on in America so much is, I think, an intentional mission from some people to make people feel hopeless. When we feel hopeless in a democracy, the democracy falls apart. We can't do that. I was raised by 2 reporters. They met at the Journal newsroom. My mother later became the vice chair of the state Democratic Party. We were raised to participate. There was a quote every day on the editorial page of the Milwaukee Sentinel, when there was a Milwaukee Sentinel. It was from the Anglo-Irish statesman Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. I amend that. He was writing in the 1700s. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good people do nothing. That's my mantra. It doesn't appear in the book, but I hope the philosophy permeates that, because that's what it's all about.
The network of mayors, Was there did you talk to a lot of mayors, and do a lot of mayors ask for your advice and vice versa throughout these times?
Well, we have a group called the Intergovernmental Cooperation Council of Milwaukee County. It's all the mayors and village presidents in Milwaukee County, of which there are 19, and the county executives, so 20 of us. We meet every month. I'm going to meet tomorrow in Glendale. We move around. We do confer on matters of common concern. But in 2020, I didn't have anybody like that. Because Wauwatosa was going through so many different things that nobody else was going through in Milwaukee County. Mayor Barrett, to some extent, he would tease people who protest at his house, and then they'd come over to my house. But Wauwatosa was just facing things that weren't being faced anywhere else locally. Mayor Rhodes Conway in Madison had violence occur in June and then again in August of 2020. If you remember what was going on in Madison, statues being toppled, businesses being trashed, a state senator getting assaulted, buildings being firebombed. I mean, it was intense up there too. But it was for shorter periods of time. I had it all year. And then we had a mass shooting. She didn't have a mass shooting up there, thankfully. And then Wauwatosa was again this small community, which was the fulcrum of the election. I mean, again, it was insane. So, to answer your question, I didn't have anybody. I felt like I was on an island, to be honest. The only other person maybe I could have talked to was Mayor Fry up in Minneapolis, and he had his own problems. I will say that on the back of the book, I have blurbs from Mayor Barrett. I also have a blurb from the former governor of Nevada, who happened to play on the Longfellow Junior High School basketball team with me back in the day. No, that's a little secret. But I also contacted the mayor of Boise, Idaho, who was mentioned in the book. She wrote a wonderful statement. She showed tremendous courage. She literally had people with torches and pitchforks at her home challenging the pandemic restrictions. Wonderful woman. I called her up and I said, you know, I respect you so much for what you went through. I'd really like you to read the book, and if you would like to give a blurb. She said, sure. She started reading it. She called me up and said, I can't do it. It's too triggering. I can't read it. I'm sorry. So there's a lot of PTSD among the mayors of this country. I don't mind saying I have PTSD. I can give you different examples, but I don't think I'll ever get over that. My wife either. Every time we hear a car horn honk, we're in the house, we jump up because we were regularly awakened out of sound sleep by car horns honking.
So, with your experience, you know, I think when, you know, the American dream in the 40s and 60s, to own your own home,
Right.
you know, we have a driving force about what it means to be an American. In your experience, I'm sure you probably thought about that a lot. I mean, you alluded to it in the Pledge of Allegiance, and that is a great guiding light. But in the time that you've spent, and the questions that you've asked yourself, like moving forward, how do we communicate to the American people about, you know, what are we doing?
Well, I have 3 children. They're adults. They're all working their way through. I worry about them, and now I have 3 grandchildren. I worry about them all the time. I don't know where we're headed as a country if people don't stand up and speak up for themselves. You know, protests are positive energy as long as they're peaceful. And people need to keep protesting. They need to keep working. But I was raised again by, I dedicate the book to my mother. Not only was she the vice chair of the state Democratic Party, she brought John Kennedy to Wauwatosa City Hall in 1960 and some other things. She covered major political conventions as a reporter. If you lose hope, it's like what Michael Jordan said about playing basketball. You miss 100% of the shots you never take. Right? We only have one choice. It's to keep hoping and keep moving forward and keep working. And if we don't do that, it's over. And for our children and our grandchildren, it's always about the next generation. You know, there was a Native American quote, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. So I lived through some pretty bad times. I'm 72 years old. I remember the 1960s very well. And the joy and the despair and the hope and the hopelessness that just went on, it was unbelievable how day after day something would change. The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the assassinations of 3 leaders, we were whipsawed. And we found a way to come out of it. Then we entered into Watergate. We came out of that. I spent my life reading about the Civil War, and I just can't imagine how America tried to repair itself after that. We still haven't repaired ourselves from the Civil War. But all I can say is we have to just keep believing in democracy. So yeah, this generation following me and the one after that, yeah, they've got some challenges that I didn't have to face. But I had to face challenges, and people before me had to face challenges. My parents grew up during the Depression. My father lost his mother at age 11. They fought a world war. You know, none of this was easy. So anyway, thank you all for listening.
Thank you.